Today we're unboxing a third generation iPad that should be running its original software version, iOS 5. I am a little bit worried about this one just due to the packaging here. This bubble mailer does not feel very secure and I can actually feel the metal corners of the iPad through it. So let's go ahead and get this opened up and hopefully the iPad is not dented too badly. And here is the iPad. Looks like I got pretty lucky because I don't see any dents on these corners. These top corners are looking perfect as well. The glass on this front panel is also looking pretty nice. There does appear to be some more noticeable wear on the back panel though. Later on in the video, we will clean up this iPad and see if any of this will come off. But for now, let's see if this iPad has any battery power. And it looks like it does, and we are met with the older style Apple logo. And perfect, there we go. We boot directly into the iOS 5 setup screen. First off, the skeuomorphic design here with the linen background was only used through iOS 6. But the main giveaway that this is iOS 5 is this lock icon in the center of the top status bar. For whatever reason, this was removed in iOS 6. Let's go through this setup process now. Okay, perfect, and here is the iOS 5 home screen. Let's jump into settings so we can see which version of iOS 5 we have. Okay, great. Well, it looks like we have the very first version of iOS 5 that was available for this iPad. And that would, of course, be iOS 5.1. Let's take a second to clean up this device so we can see if any of these marks will come off. And here is how that back panel cleaned up. Really, there's only 2 nicks in the aluminum that remain. I connected this iPad to my Mac to find the battery health, and it turns out it's at 99% with only 3 cycles. So it definitely appears that this iPad was hardly ever used. This third generation model was released in March of 2012 as the successor to the 2011 iPad 2. And as you can see, these two were pretty much identical, at least at first glance. But the big standout feature for the third generation was the retina display. The retina display had launched 2 years back on the 2010 iPhone 4. And these type of displays got their name by being so sharp that the retinas in your eye could not discern individual pixels on them from a normal viewing distance. But the iPhone's retina display was 3.5 inches at the time, so it was really impressive to have it here on a 9.7 inch iPad. This panel had a resolution of 2048 by 1536. So that came out to 3.1 million pixels, 4 times what the iPad 2 had. And here's a close-up comparison of the Retina display versus the non-Retina. So here you can definitely notice the pixels, especially with smaller details. But with the Retina display on the third generation, everything was just so sharp. At the launch event for this iPad though, Apple was really reluctant to call it the iPad third generation or the iPad 3. Instead, they seemed to be really adamant about just calling it the new iPad. They would later go on to refer to it as the third generation. So the whole new iPad thing was probably just an early marketing tactic. There were some more upgrades for this model aside from the Retina display. So it received a new variation of the A5 processor called the A5X. And that added quad-core graphics to the standard A5 chip from the iPad 2. And that helped power the Retina display. It also got a bump from 512 megabytes of RAM to a full 1 gigabyte. And it was the very first iOS device to receive that. This model also got a huge upgrade to the rear-facing camera. So it was now a 5 megapixel sensor capable of recording in 1080p. So that was a huge upgrade over the iPad 2's sub 1 megapixel camera. And that rear 5 megapixel on the third generation was physically larger than what was on the iPad 2. So although there wasn't a ton of photos and videos being taken with iPad at the time, it was still really nice to have that upgrade. Unfortunately though, the third generation front camera did not get an upgrade. So it was still a pretty poor quality VGA camera, similar to what the iPhone 4 and 4S had. This iPad had a really huge battery. It was over 11,000 milliamp hours, while the iPad 2 had around 6,500. But that increased size was only used to power the Retina display. This was quoted to have the same 10 hours of battery life as the iPad 2. Giving this model the Retina display and the bigger battery though did mean that it was slightly thicker than the iPad 2. It was just 0.8 millimeters thicker, but it was a little bit noticeable. The third generation was also heavier by 51 grams. So it's kind of funny, but if you're experienced in handling both of these models, you can easily tell the third generation from the 2 by the added heft. The iPad 3 here also had some improved microphones, so it had a new dictation feature. And to use that, you would just press this microphone button on the keyboard. So here's a test of the dictation feature on the third generation iPad. And there we go, that was pretty cool. It was almost a Siri-like interface. But it's really interesting because the third generation iPad here did not originally support Siri. The Siri voice assistant had just launched last fall on the iPhone 4S. So it was really strange that this brand new flagship iPad did not support it. Apple would later add Siri to this model with the iOS 6 update in fall of 2012. This launched at the typical iPad price of $499. That got you the base 16GB model like I have here, but you could also step up to 32 or 64GB for $100 or $200 extra. And you could also get a cellular model, but there was quite a bit of controversy about those. Apple originally marketed them as Wi-Fi plus 4G, but they later changed the term just to Wi-Fi and cellular due to some controversies about the 4G speeds. And lastly, you could choose between the white display bezel or the black. This iPad was pretty well received at launch, as the Retina display really was stunning. Also, when this model launched at $499, it dropped the price of the iPad 2 down to $399. So that was a new low price to get into an iPad. But the third generation here would only last for around 7 months, being discontinued in October of 2012. At that point, it was replaced with the fourth generation, which brought the Lightning connector as well as the A6 chip and an improved front-facing camera. So many customers that had just bought a third generation were rightfully pretty upset. And some Apple stores would actually extend their return policy to accommodate them. Also, there was a new smart case accessory that launched alongside the third generation iPad. So it was really cool to have this option for full protection of your iPad, just because the previous smart cover would only offer protection for the display. So now let's take a second to look at iOS 5 on this iPad specifically. And this was a really important version, bringing a lot of the features and conveniences that we still use today. Probably the most notable of those would be iCloud. So iCloud enabled really seamless syncing of your content across all Apple devices. So things like photos, apps, notes, and your messages, those would now always be in sync wirelessly without you having to go out of your way to manually do so. And me explaining that all might sound kind of weird, but if you lived before iCloud, you know how much of a pain that all could be. iCloud gave all users a free 5GB of storage. And it also brought cool features like iCloud Backup as well as Find My iPhone. Something else really integral that iOS 5 brought was iMessage. So those blue bubbles that we're all so familiar with started in this version. And it was just so nice to have features like read and delivered receipts as well as typing notifications and the ability to message over Wi-Fi. That was especially a game changer for iPads as well as iPod Touches, as you could message anyone else with an Apple device using only an email. Another area that got a huge upgrade in iOS 5 was notifications. So there was now a notification center where all of your previous notifications would remain. With iOS 4 in previous versions, there was no centralized place where they would stay. So you kind of had to rely on things like badges for your applications to make sure all of your notifications were attended to. But having the notification center made that so much easier. This version also introduced the banner style notification. And those are the small, non-persistent notifications that come from the top of your display. With prior iOS versions, every notification will come up in the center of your display and require immediate action. This was also the first version to feature wireless software update. And as you saw at the beginning of the video, you can now set up your device without a computer. That's another one of those that probably sounds weird, but with iOS 4 and prior, you had to connect your device to a computer for the initial activation. There were a few new apps for iOS 5, so reminders here was new, as well as the newsstand folder. Also for iPads and iPhones, the iPod app was now split between music and videos. And there were now some fun multitasking gestures for the iPad. So you could swipe up with 4 fingers to access multitasking. And you could use a 5-finger pinch to go home. Also, if you were in an application, you could swipe with 4 fingers to go back. And the emoji keyboard in this version was now somewhat integrated. So you could now just go into settings to activate it. It was still a little bit of a process to dig through all of these menus. But once you did, you could easily add the emoji keyboard. With iOS 4 and previous versions, you would actually have to download a separate emoji application from the App Store in order to activate that. But now that we have it activated, we can take a look at the old school iOS 5 emojis. And I think these are just so nostalgic to look at. Also, one more note about the keyboard on iOS 5 is that you could easily split it now on the iPad. So that was really helpful for typing on a device as large as this. This was the last iOS version to feature a couple built-in Google apps. So first off, we have YouTube here. Unfortunately, this will no longer work, but it was really cool that this used to be built into iOS. The other one we have here is Google Maps. This one actually still works. You can use this really cool page curl animation to switch to satellite view. And I always love checking out Google Street View on here, so let's try to go to New York City. And okay, here near Central Park, let's drop a pin and see if we can access Street View. And there we go. Yes, it's so cool that this is still working here on iOS 5. The App Store no longer works on iOS 5, but I was able to sync these applications from an older version of iTunes I have. So it's really fun to take a look at these classic games. This one here is actually not optimized for iPad. So you'll see it loads in a blown up version of the iPhone application. And you can actually use this 1x, 2x button here to go between those views. Ironically, I think this is the view you still have to use with the Instagram application on iPads in 2025. We'll also take a look at the default wallpapers here. So a pretty nice selection here. There are 34 to choose from. This water image here was the default only for iOS 5 on the 3rd generation iPad. These water droplets were the default for any other device running iOS 4 or 5. And we have some other fun choices here like the default wallpaper for the original iPad, as well as the original globe image from the first iPhone. But I think for this model, we have to leave the default that was meant for it. So that pretty much concludes my look at this 3rd generation iPad running its original software version iOS 5.1. I think this is a really interesting model, even though it is notorious for only being on sale for 7 months. And sadly, it did not age too gracefully as it received software support through iOS 9. As you may have heard, iOS 9 is not very kind to devices with an A5 processor. This one did go over slightly better than the others because it was the A5X with a full 1GB of RAM. But still, performance with that version was not ideal. So leave me a comment below with your thoughts on this iPad and be sure to get subscribed for more iOS devices running their original versions. Thank you so much for watching and I'll see you guys in the next one.